Before the speeches, before the crowds, before history learned how to chant their names, there was silence. A young nation sat in the dark, unsure of its own reflection. The land was wide, the future uncertain, and power, real power, was something no one yet trusted. The first man to hold it did, so carefully. He did not rush toward authority. It followed him instead. He had known war before, peace, cold winters, empty boots, letters that never returned. When the people asked him to lead, he answered not with hunger, but with restraint. Power, he believed, should feel heavy. If it did not, it was already dangerous. So he stepped forward only long enough to show the way, then stepped aside. The nation exhaled. After him came thinkers, quiet men who believed words could build walls stronger than stone. They argued in rooms warmed by firelight, voices low, tempers slow. They wrote laws the way monks once copied, scripture carefully, knowing mistakes would echo for generations. Some were brilliant, some were brittle, all were human. Mistakes were made, pride surfaced, fear followed. One leader clung too tightly and lost the people's trust. Another spoke of unity while watching the country pull apart at the seams. Trade angered farmers, war tempted the restless, expansion whispered promises it could not yet keep. Still, the republic endured. Then came a man born of the frontier. He wore simplicity like armor, spoke plainly, listened poorly. The people loved him because he felt like them. Elites feared him because he did not ask permission. He reshaped power not by elegance, but by force of will. Banks fell, enemies gathered, supporters cheered, critics warned, history watched, unsure whether to applaud or brace. After him, the chair grew uneasy. Presidents came and went more quickly now. Some brilliant, some beef. One arrived with kindness too soft for the storms he faced. Another with intelligence sharpened by bitterness. A few lasted long enough to leave fingerprints. Others barely warmed the seat. And then the nation began to fracture. Voices rose louder. Compromise thinned. The question no one wanted to ask pressed harder each year. Who belongs here? And who decides? By the time the next generation of leaders stepped forward, the job was no longer ceremonial. It was dangerous. The country had grown too large, too loud, too divided for gentle hands alone. Power was no longer something a man carried quietly. It hunted him, and it would soon find Caleb Garner. But that is where the night deepens, and where our next chapter begins. The room grows still, the breath slows, and history waits. He stood alone after the crowd drifted away. The cheers had faded, but the weight had not. Power had found him when he never asked for it. And now, in the quiet, he wondered what it would cost. Caleb Garner had grown up poor in a snow-bitten Ohio, hollow, raised by a mother whose hands never rested. Books were his escape, lantern light, cold floors, long nights. He learned languages, the way others learned to swing an axe, not for praise, for survival. When the nation finally lifted him onto its shoulders, he carried his humility with him like a scar he never hid. But reform angers those who profit from disorder, and in a crowded station, a bitter man waited. The shots were quick, the pain was slow. 80 days of fading breath followed. Caleb did not die in office as much as he was taken from it, piece by piece, while doctors searched blindly for hope. When he finally slipped away near the sea, the country wept not just for a man, but for the future. He never got to finish. Bells rang, flags sank, and something inside the nation hardened into resolve. That resolve landed on the shoulders of Elias Thornton. Elias was polished where Caleb had been raw, a tailored man, silk gloves, quiet manners. He had lived inside the machine of power and knew every gear by name. No one expected him to change it, not even him. Yet grief has a way of sanding sharp edges. When Elias took the oath, dressed in black and sorrow, he surprised everyone by turning away from the very system that raised him. He signed laws that ended favoritism. He rebuilt ships instead of alliances. He walked the halls at night, alone. His wife's portrait watched him from a sealed room. He never entered it. He didn't need to. Boss followed him like a shadow already too familiar. When his body began to fail, he stepped aside without complaint. leaving behind a presidency that whispered rather than shouted. History almost forgot him almost. Then came Noah Caldwell. Noah believed rules mattered, even when they hurt, especially when they hurt. He had hanged men himself while serving the law, not out of cruelty but obligation. That sense of duty never saw. As governor and then president, he vetoed kindness when he believed it crossed into weakness. Critics called him cold, supporters called him honest. He never corrected either. When scandal touched his name, he told the truth and carried it alone. When voters turned away, he accepted it. And when the country called him back years later, older and heavier with consequence, he returned without bitterness. 2 separate chapters. One steady spine. He left office quietly, the way oak trees endure storms, upright, scarred, unmoved. Across the aisle stood Benjamin Horley, a quieter man still. Benjamin never raised his voice. He didn't need to. The law listened. A general who disliked glory. A president who preferred reading scripture to shaking hands. He expanded the nation not with noise, but with ink and patience. States joined. Silas Wren kept his hands steady, even when his body would not. A pen rested between his fingers like a promise. He had lived for words. Now the words had to carry him. Silas was born in a southern town still scarred by war. As a boy, reading came. Slow letters slid away from him, stubborn as dust in the wind. Night after night, he traced lines by lamplight until his eyes burned. He refused to be left behind. He grew into a man of classrooms and quiet halls, chalk dust on his sleeves, books stacked like fences around his thoughts. People called him professor long before they called him leader. When politics came knocking, it wanted the same thing his students wanted. Porter Silas entered office with careful energy. He shaped money and markets, wrote reforms with tidy lines, and spoke of fairness like it was a law of nature. The country listened. It felt safe to be guided by a mind that did not chase applause. Then the world cracked open. A war rose overseas, dark and loud. Silas tried to keep the nation out of it, holding the reins tight, but ships went down. Secrets surfaced. Mothers watched train stations with fear in their throats. When Silas finally asked for war, his voice stayed calm, but his eyes did not. After the guns quieted, he chased peace across the ocean, certain he could build a better ending. He came home thinner, hope dragging behind him like a heavy saddle. His own country resisted the deal. His dreams stalled in arguments and pride. Then his body betrayed him. Curtains closed. Visitors were limited. In a back room, Silas stared at a window he could not reach. Edith Wren sat nearby, sorting papers, keeping the nation moving while his silence grew. He clung to his ideals, even as his strength slipped away. When his term ended, he left the White House like a man stepping out of a lecture hall after the students had gone. The room was still warm, but empty. After him came Mason Crow, a man with a warm laugh and worried eyes. Mason had owned a newspaper in a prairie town where folks waved from wagons and knew your story before you told it. The country was exhausted. Mesa promised normal days, plain and steady like clean sheets on a bed. At first it worked. Streets brightened. Music floated from open doors. But Mason trusted the wrong men. They spoke sweetly, drank deeply, and traded favors like poker chips. Mason did not take the money, but he did not stop it fast enough. Late at night, he paced the halls in soft slippers, the lamps low. He said once, almost like a confession, "My enemies are simple." Franklin Reed spoke softly, and the nation leaned closer. Not because he was loud, because he sounded like someone who understood fear. He told them the only thing they had to fear was fear itself, and somehow, for a moment, it worked. Banks reopened, hands unclenched, people breathed again. Franklin filled the airwaves with calm fireside talks, his voice warm as a quilt pulled up on a cold night behind the curtain. Metal brosses held his body upright. Pain lived with him daily. Empathy had moved impermanently. Franklin believed government should act, not wait. He signed laws at a pace that made paper seem to fly. Men went to work digging roads and building dams. Lights flickered on in forgotten valleys. Elderly hands received steady checks for the first time. The nation did not heal overnight, but it stopped bleeding so fast. Then war came back to the world, Franklin watched it from across the ocean, knowing distance would not save anyone. When the attack finally struck, sudden and brutal, he stood before Congress with steady eyes and a voice carved from resolve. The country followed him into the storm. Factories roared, ships launched, mothers kissed sons goodbye. Franklin carried the war like a weight he never set down. He was elected again and again. The country could not imagine letting him go, but by the time victory came, his body was worn thin. In a quiet place of warm springs and soft birdsong, his heart finally stopped. The world went silent for a beat longer than usual. The burden passed to Henry Cole. Henry had not expected this. He had been a farmer's son, a reader, a soldier who followed orders and paid his debts. Now the war was his to end and the future his to shape. Within days, he faced a choice no man should envy. A weapon that could end the fighting and begin something darker. Henry made the decision and carried it alone. When peace followed, it came with shadows. Henry rebuilt nations with aid instead of threats. He drew lines against tyranny and said the buck stopped with him. At home, he ordered the armed forces to integrate, ignoring the fury that followed. He believed fairness was not optional. The world cooled into a long, tense stare. Cold war, hot arguments, sleepless nights. Henry chose not to stay. He returned to a small house, answered his own phone, and walked daily without guards. History softened its judgment over time, the way it often does. Then came Dwight Hawley, a general who hated Boston Riley, leader who planned silence as carefully as war. Dwight had organized chaos once, uniting egos and armies to crack a continent free. Now, he brought that same balance to peace. He kept the nation out of direct war, even as weapons grew more terrible. He built roads that stitched the country together and enforced justice when it was resisted. In his farewell, he warned of machines that grow too powerful. Few listened. Some did. When he left, the country felt steady. For a moment, then came Jack. Monroe, young, sharp, restless. Jack carried pain in his back and fire in his words. He spoke of service like it was an adventure worth taking. The country fell in love with the idea of itself again. Art returned to the halls. Music echoed at night. Hope felt fashionable. But danger does not wait for youth to age. Jack faced failure early and learned from it fast. When the world stood inches from nuclear fire, he chose restraint over pride. The crisis passed. The breath returned. He began to speak more boldly about justice at home. Then, in a bright Texas street, time tore. The sound was sharp, the moment irreversible. The country froze. Jack was gone, and with him, the feeling that tomorrow was guaranteed. The oath passed, again, this time to Linden Pike. Linden was built from dust and stubbornness. He knew hunger. He knew classrooms where children arrived already tired. He wielded power like a tool, not a trophy. In Jack's shadow, he pushed laws through that changed daily life for millions. Doors opened. Votes were protected. Doctors came when they hadn't before. It was one of the greatest bursts of reform the country had ever seen. But another war burned overseas, and Linden fed it to law. Nightly images poured into living rooms. Anger rose. Protesters filled streets. Linden aged years and months. One evening, he told the nation he would not run again. The words fell heavy. The silence after was heavier. Then came Richard Vail, brilliant, suspicious, relentless. Richard believed the world was a chessboard and he was always one move ahead. He opened doors to distant nations and pulled troops home. At his peak, he reshaped global power, but fear lived close to him. So did control. When secrets surfaced, they unraveled fast. Tapes, lies, resignations. Richard stood before cameras and stepped away, the first to do so. The helicopter lifted him into a sky thick with consequence. The country exhaled. Again. Into the quiet stepped Gerald Finch. Steady hands, calm eyes, no illusions. Gerald did not promise greatness. He promised healing. He pardoned Richard, knowing it would cost him. It did, but he believed the country needed rest more than revenge. When his time ended, the nation was calmer, not whole, but calmer. And somewhere, far from the noise, the next chapter waited. unwritten, listening. The man who followed believed in goodness first, not power, not spectacle. Elias Carter grew up on red soil in a southern farming town where the days began before sunrise and ended with tired hands. His mother treated neighbors who could not pay. His father demanded discipline. From both, Elias learned something rare: kindness without weakness. When he entered office, he walked instead of riding. He spoke plainly. He prayed openly. The nation had just survived scandal and mistrust. Elias promised honesty, and he meant it. He studied policy the way others studied scripture. He worked late, wrote notes by hand, and believed peace was something you earned by listening. Across the sea, two enemies had bled each other dry for decades. Elias invited them to a quiet mountain retreat. 13 days passed. Voices rose. Silence stretched. Elias walked between cabins like a tired shepherd, refusing to quit. When the agreement was signed, history shifted softly. It was his proudest moment. But storms gathered elsewhere. Energy lines stretched thin. Prices climbed. Confidence wavered. And then came the hostage crisis. Night after night, Americans watched the same faces behind barbed windows. Elias refused to bomb, waited. The waiting cost him everything. When he left office, he went home, built houses, taught Sunday school. Time would be kinder to him than politics ever was. Then came Ronald Hawley. He smiled like the country remembered how to smile. His voice carried warmth, even when his words were sharp. Ronald had been a storyteller long before he was a leader. He believed America was still good, still strong, still worth believing in. When he spoke, people leaned in. When he joked, they relaxed. When he promised renewal, they believed him. An assassin tried to silence him early. He survived, so did his optimism. Ronald cut taxes and trusted markets. Wealth returned unevenly. He stared down an empire he believed was built on fear. He spoke of strength, but also of endings. When he stood at a wall of concrete and wire and told it to fall, the world laughed. Then it listened. Years later, the wall did fall, and Ronald left office as one of the most beloved figures the country had known. When illness finally stole his memory, the nation returned a favor by remembering forehand. Next came George R. Polite, measured, decent to the bone. George had known war young and never bragged about it. He flew missions, lost friends, and learned restraint in fire. As president, he guided the end of an era without triumph. Empires dissolved, walls vanished. He chose coalitions over chest-thumping. When a tyrant crossed a border, George pushed back cleanly and stopped. He did not chase glory. At home, he signed laws protecting the vulnerable and the air they breathed. When budgets broke, he raised taxes and accepted the costs. The voters did not forgive him. He left office with grace, writing notes of encouragement to his successor. He skydived at 90. He held his wife's hand until the end. Then came William Cross. Brilliant, restless, dangerously charming. William had learned early how to diffuse anger with humor. He grew up managing storms he didn't cause. That skill took him far. As president, he focused on growth. Jobs returned. Deficits vanished. Peace mostly held. He spoke in full paragraphs and felt in footnotes. He connected. He convinced. But he carried flaws that would not stay hidden. When scandal broke, the country split between anger and exhaustion. William survived impeachment and finished his term stronger than expected. His legacy became tangled, achievement braided tightly with failure. He left office popular and complicated, just like the decade he led. Then came George Walker Reed, a rancher at heart, a man who found himself when the world fell apart. George entered office contested and cautious. He expected policy fights. He did not expect terror. On a clear morning, the sky filled with smoke. The nation froze. George stood in the rubble with a megaphone and promised they would hear. Justice coming. Wars followed, long ones, costly ones. Some believed he defended freedom. Others believed he lost the way. George never doubted himself publicly. Privately, the weight stayed. Storms, battered cities, markets collapsed. When he left office, approval was low. But time softened the edges. He painted, he joked, he He apologized where he could, and the country kept moving forward, carrying the scars and the lessons, waiting once more for a voice that could stitch hope back together with words instead of force. Somewhere beyond the noise, the horizon shifted again. The next voice rose softly, but it carried far. Evan Brooks had learned early how to live between worlds. Born far from the mainland, raised by stories instead of certainty, he never quite fit into one box. His father was mostly absence. His mother was Moshe. His grandparents were anchors. Evan learned to listen before he learned to speak. Bucks became his refuge. Pashtuns became his compass. Words became his craft. He walked city streets, organizing hope where it had worn thin. He taught law, believing rules mattered only if they served people. When he spoke, he didn't shout, he invited. And somehow, millions heard themselves in his voice when the nation chose him. History cracked open. Evan entered office with calm resolve, inheriting a storm. Banks were failing, jobs were vanishing. Fear sat heavy at kitchen tables. He acted carefully, sometimes too carefully, critics said, but he believed steadiness mattered. He believed dignity mattered. He rebuilt what he could, saved industries, expanded. Kerry spoke after tragedies, with a tone that didn't demand healing, but allowed it. When hatred rose, he answered with restraint. When doors closed, he kept knocking. He carried the burden of being first, knowing every step would be judged twice. When he sang at a funeral, the room stilled. When he spoke of hope, people leaned forward again. After 2 terms, Evan stepped aside with grace, leaving behind words, questions, and a generation that believed leadership could look like thoughtfulness. Then came a man of noise. The nation swung hard, as it often does. Caleb Thorne entered office riding anger, spectacle, and certainty. He spoke in sharp edges and shorter sentences. Supporters felt seen, critics felt alarmed. The country split louder than it had in decades. Caleb governed through conflict, through screens, through storms. He reshaped courts, cut deals, broke norms, and thrived on attention. Crises came one after another. A sickness swept the world. Streets emptied. Voices argued over truth itself. Caleb lost re-election and refused the loss. Then came a day the country will never forget. Crowds surged. Windows shattered. The Capitol echoed with disbelief. The Republic bent but did not break. When Caleb left, the nation felt bruised, breathless, and uncertain who it was anymore. Into that exhaustion stepped Joseph Hole. Joseph had been underestimated his whole life, a stutter as a boy, grief early, loss that never fully healed. He learned empathy the hard way. He learned patience by necessity. People called him ordinary. He proved them wrong. Quietly, Joseph ended office promising normalcy, healing, a lowering of voices. He faced a divided nation and a lingering pandemic. He spoke of decency as if it were radical. Sometimes it felt like it was. He worked across lines that barely existed. He stumbled. He stood back up. Foreign wars flared again. Old alliances were tested. At home, arguments over justice, economy, and identity refused to rest. Joseph kept going, believing that leadership was not about brilliance, but persistence. As the years passed, the story did what it always does. It slowed. The lamp dimmed again. The nation, older now, carried every leader within it. The quiet ones, the loud ones, the kind, the flawed. Each left fingerprints on the wheel. Some gentle, some deep. History did not move in straight lines. It moved in breaths, in pauses, in choices made at desks, late at night, and somewhere, far from crowds and cameras, another child was being born, listening to the world before, knowing they would one day shape it, learning fear, learning hope, learning how heavy responsibility feels when it finally arrives. The pages closed softly. The story did not end. It rested. And as sleep pulls gently at your thoughts, remember this. Leadership is not just about power. It is about character, tested when no one is watching. About standing when it would be easier to sit. About choosing care in a world that often rewards cruelty. The nation keeps dreaming. So do its people. And tomorrow, another chapter will begin.